Welcome to the Christmas Enrichment series at the Dwellings, the series called O Tiny Home of Bethlehem. We are at the second conference, the Little Drummer House, and in this one we shall be discussing the visit of the shepherds to the place of Christ's birth. We are examining these Christmas stories not so much from a simple religious perspective, but from a cultural perspective, one in which we might understand these texts as much as possible according to the perspective of those who first heard them, these stories, in the first century, hoping that by approximating their feeling, their understanding and appreciation of the text, we might enter into the texts and to the season of Christmas, therefore, with greater enrichment than otherwise. So I would like to begin by reading from the Gospel of St. Luke, the story of the shepherds, well known from the second chapter. There were shepherds in that region living in the fields and keeping night watch by turning over their flocks. The angel of the Lord appeared to them as the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were very much afraid. The angel said to them, "You have nothing to fear. I have come to proclaim good news to you, tidings of great joy to be shared by the whole people. This day in David's city, a Savior has been born to you, the Messiah and Lord. Let this be a sign to you. In a manger, you will find an infant wrapped in swaddling clothes." Suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly hosts praising God and saying, "Glory to God in high heaven, peace on earth to those on whom his favor rests." When the angels had returned to heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go over to Bethlehem and see this event which the Lord had made known to us." They went in haste and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in the manger. Once they saw, they understood what had been told them concerning the child. All who heard of it were astonished at the report given them by the shepherds. Mary treasured all these things and reflected on them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, in accord with what had been told them. So there is the wonderful text as recorded in the Gospel of St. Luke. I want to put that story in a perspective which would match the audience, the first audience, if not even the mentality of the writer of the text. First of all, it is important to remember that according to the mind and mentality of the children of Israel, for 1,000 years prior to the time of Jesus, all the way up until the first century, shepherds were regarded as inherently unclean men. That is to say, by decree, they were not permitted to enter into the congregation of Israel for any spiritual purposes. They couldn't offer sacrifices, for instance. They weren't a part of the synagogue. They weren't allowed into the temple precincts with the faithful of Judea. They were regarded as unclean. Unclean is a category of religious ritual for which we have very little natural feeling in the 21st century. As children, we sometimes had a feeling of unclean when there were objects to which we had revulsion for no apparent reason. There are things to which we feel repelled for no apparent cause. Cultures give them to us. For instance, in our culture, insects with 6 legs, while a little bit of a bother to us, are things that we brush off and step on. But if an insect has 8 legs, some people will run away and scream. That is to say, an ant or a fly is a bother, but a spider is a terror. Why that is the case is because our culture has conditioned us to think about creatures with 2 legs, 4 legs, and 6 legs as good, and 8 legs or no legs, spiders and snakes, as very bad. And if you really learn this cultural affect very well, then centipedes are the most scary thing of all. But that's cultural. There are places where people eat spiders for food. We have learned it so early in our lives when we were learning to speak our language and to feel the aesthetics of our families. We learned it so early, so young, that we have no capacity to unlearn it. And only with great care can we shrug off such repulsions as these. The children of Israel had their own cultural program of revulsion. Certain animals with cloven hooves versus those with non-cloven. Animals which, like cows, chew their cud, that is, have several stomachs and they digest and redigest their food. Those were good, but animals which didn't have multiple stomachs and cloven hooves, imagine, were bad. Pigs. You couldn't touch them. You couldn't certainly eat them. Because they had part of the apparatus of a barnyard animal and part of the apparatus of a human being. And that was scary, a scary hybrid in the Hebrew mind. And you had to stand aloof from it as from something unclean. It's not morally bad, just unclean. I don't think a spider is a bigger sinner than an ant. It's just unclean. Shepherds were unclean, and for the Jewish people, the category of clean versus unclean, pure versus impure, polluted, it's sometimes so called, all those categories were felt, and they were integrated into the religion. One should not eat that which makes one sick. There was a television show some years ago, Fear Factor, I think, in which people were asked to eat horrific things. There was never a more non-Jewish TV show than that. The idea that you would put in your mouth something which made you repellent is against the Old Testament code of ethics. Don't do that. Respect your boundaries. Respect what makes you uncomfortable versus what makes you comfortable. And so shepherds were unclean because they were in touch with things which were repellent to the people of Israel. What? Well, the children of Israel were repulsed by blood outside the body. Blood inside the body, the blue vein, wonderful. Blood outside the body, crimson, red, spilling onto the ground, horrific. Crimson blood, bad. Blue blood, good. In the body, great. Out of the body, terrible. And so anything which touched blood outside the body made the Jews repulse. So they had to have a very special kind of slaughterhouse, a very special kind of koshering. The blood let out entirely, so that when you cooked the meat, there was no blood on it. Don't get your Jewish friends a coupon for a steakhouse for Christmas. You will strike out on several layers there. Shepherds had blood on them, the blood of birthing sheep, the blood of shearing sheep when they cut them, the blood of animals who were attacking their sheep, whom they sometimes had to fight off. There were other things they had on them that you would have on you following sheep around in a field all day long. Other bodily humors which made them unclean, unfit. They had to do this all the time. It was their job. Have you ever met blue-collar workers whose calluses were filthy no matter how many times they washed their hands? They just had the dirt built into their skin. Hands were always unclean. Shepherds were always unclean because in the imagination of the children of Israel, the shepherd was always in that muck and always at that blood. Shepherds were the least likely people we might expect to be given the angelic visitation to go to the tiny house at Bethlehem, or in this case, perhaps to a stable at the perimeter of the city. We don't understand this about shepherds so much as we ought, because the most popular verse in the Bible is from the Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd. So we think of shepherds as grand persons, great men who do pastoral things, good things by way of maintaining their flock, caring for the sheep. Of course, David would write such a psalm as this, or be imputed to be the author of that psalm, because in his youth he was a shepherd. But it was a shock, nevertheless, to regard God as a shepherd. Because if God was a shepherd and Israel was his flock, then, if you will, it was Israel that made God unclean by his care and maintenance of his people. He would be associated with wretched sinners, potential criminals, the unfaithful which was always associated with the people of the covenant in every generation, infidelity. So it was a kind of a penance on the part of the Hebrew people to recite the Psalm of David, "The Lord is my shepherd." That is to say, they were basically, we are the ones who make him unclean. That will have a lot of New Testament associations when Jesus becomes the shepherd of Israel, as it were, and is rendered utterly unclean by his passion. But we are just looking at the text at the time of the birth of Jesus here. What would those shepherds have meant? Now, there is a story in the Old Testament about David that is worthy of sharing here, since he's the one who cast the Lord in that role as shepherd. We should see it against this background. When David was a youth, he was of a family in Bethlehem of no account, of no special account, and he was hardly a likely successor to the king. But the king who was ruling Israel at the time of the youth of David was a particularly bad one, and God's prophet was looking for a successor. And God sent his prophet to Bethlehem to find an heir, to find a new king to replace a bad one. And that's where we pick up this story, 1 Samuel 16. The Lord said to Samuel, the prophet, "Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, for I have chosen my king from among his sons." Samuel did as the Lord had commanded. When he entered Bethlehem, the elders of the city came trembling to meet him. Of course they're trembling, right? He's coming with a horn of oil. He's going to anoint a new king. There could be civil war. "Is your visit peaceful, O seer?" they asked. He replied, "Yes, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. So, cleanse yourselves and join me today for the banquet." There's going to be a sacrifice. You have to be ritually pure. Cleanse yourselves. Anyone who can be cleansed, get cleansed. He had Jesse and his sons cleanse themselves and invited them to the sacrifice. As they came, he looked at Eliab, the eldest, and he thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is here." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not judge from his appearance or from his lofty stature, because I have rejected him. Not as man sees, does God see. Because man sees the appearance, but the Lord looks into the heart." Then Jesse called a second son, Amminadab, and presented him before Samuel, who said, "The Lord has not chosen him." Next, Jesse presented Shammah, but Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." In the same way, Jesse presented 7 sons before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Then Samuel asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" Just a pause. 7 is a lot of sons. I would never think, is there another? It's kind of an inspired question. 7 sons were presented. Are these all? Jesse replied, "There is still the youngest who is tending the sheep." Samuel said to Jesse, "Send for him. We will not begin the sacrificial banquet until he arrives." That's a problem. He's tending the sheep. Why isn't he there already? He's tending the sheep. They all cleanse themselves. He's tending the sheep. He can't be cleansed. He's a shepherd boy. But the Samuel prophet says, bring him anyways. So Jesse sent and had the youngest brought to them. He was ruddy, faces lined for a youth. That means he's in the wind and rain and sun all day, every day. He really is a shepherd. He was ruddy, a youth, handsome to behold, and making a splendid appearance. A splendid appearance for a shepherd. That is to say, wild hair and this weathered look, and someone who is not completely couth. It's splendid, though here the word splendid also means out of the ordinary. Extraordinary, not ordinary good looks by any means, but something rustic and rough. The Lord said, there, anoint him, this is he. Then Samuel, with the horn of oil in hand, anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David. David was powerfully affirmed in the midst of his brothers. That is to say, this particular son of Jesse was used to being marginal, and now in the midst of his family was affirmed absolutely. And of course, when one feels, believes, senses affirmation, the Spirit rushes. One comes alive. One now knows one has a purpose. That's what we are doing when we stage people's restoration in a tiny home community, right? We give them a blessing, a vote of confidence, something good to look at, beautiful to receive, something which they had not thought was ever going to come back their way again in life, hoping that a spirit of a new life, a future, a second chance will rush upon them, and they will seize it, as David did. But here's the point. David was a shepherd who did not expect to become a critical player in his family's life, far less the leader of a dynasty from which in Christmas we celebrate its final descendant. David did not expect this. But he was a shepherd who turned that reversal into a blessing. He didn't shrug off having been a shepherd and pretend that he never was a shepherd. He wrote a psalm instead. The Lord is my shepherd. He made his suffering from the past an opportunity of affirmation for the future. He looked upon the reversals through which he passed as a badge. Take up your mat and carry it when you had been crippled. Take up that history of being a shepherd and make it into a vote of confidence. That's what David did when he said, the Lord is my shepherd. And then he did something else later in life. When he had become king decades later, he had collected all the resources necessary to rebuild the temple of God in Jerusalem. Solomon, his son, would actually build it. But he had taken all the sacrifices of Israel, all the cult, all the practices of prayer, and centralized it into his capital, Jerusalem, which is only a few miles from Bethlehem. And then he did something that almost all potentates and presidents do. He monetized his family a bit. That is to say, he made a rule and told it to the priests of the temple sacrifices. The only sheep which will be sacrificed in this temple must be proven to be pure for God, because they are purchased from the fields of Bethlehem nearby. And the priests of the temple, they are compelled by law to guard the flocks of Bethlehem and to comb through them to find the sheep which are the best, the holy, the perfect, the pure. They must guarantee the purity of the lamb from the moment it is born to the next year, when as a yearling it is sacrificed in the temple for Passover, for instance. They will be Levite, that is priest, shepherds. And thereby he raised up the flocks of Bethlehem and the shepherds of Bethlehem to a very profitable place in the kingdom of Israel. Late in the Middle Ages, one of the popes of Rome was erecting an obelisk in the courtyard of the Vatican. It had been brought from Egypt. And as the obelisk was being raised up into its proper place, still there now, it began to wobble and was about to fall. One of the construction workers, engineers on site, worked very quickly with cables and very strategically and with, I think, great insight, and stabilized the obelisk just before it tipped. The Pope was so grateful, he promised that man anything he wanted as a reward. And the man said, all I want is this. On my family's farm, we have many palm trees. I want the palm branches of my family's farm to be the palms of Palm Sunday throughout all of Italy. The Pope said, yours. And so as a result of that monetizing of his family's farm, his family became a very wealthy family. All the palms of Palm Sunday across all the churches of Italy, he made a fortune. David did this with the sheep of Bethlehem. He monetized it brilliantly. And so for the next 1,000 years, those sheep were watched by Levite shepherds, by priestly shepherds. They built a tower near the city of Bethlehem. From that tower, they surveyed the lambs when they should drop their young. And when they would do so, then they would go out and bring that lamb and place them inside the shelter of that tower. That is the background by which we should return to that story from the Gospel of St. Matthew. There were shepherds living in the field watching their sheep. Very likely they were Levite shepherds. And if they were in the fields watching for the sheep, that meant it was the time of the year when the sheep were dropping their young. There was a subbreed of sheep known to the districts of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which dropped their sheep, their lambs, the ewes dropped their young anytime between December and March. And so they would live in the fields by night because they had to get that lamb and keep it pure so that it could be brought to the temple for sacrifice, an appropriate gift to God. While they're there, watching for sheep, watching for the ewe lamb, or ewe to the mother to drop the young, the angels visit them and tell them there is a child in a manger, a feeding trough. And they go, and they find, proximate to the town of Bethlehem, they find the child. Where is that child? Let me read to you from the Old Testament prophet Micah, a verse which would have been of some significance to the people of Israel at the time of the birth of Jesus. Micah chapter 4. In the days to come, the mount of the Lord's house shall be established higher than the mountains. The people shall stream to it. Many nations shall come and say, let us climb the mount of the Lord, that we may walk in his ways. Then he goes on to say within the same verses, and you, O Magdal Eder, hillock of daughter Zion, unto you shall it come. The former dominion shall be restored, the kingdom of the daughter Jerusalem. And you, Magdal Eder, it's a Hebrew term. The author, the translators of the Hebrew Bible into English don't know what word to use to translate it, so they just give us a transcription of the Hebrew. Magdal Eder, it means basically, and you tower, watchtower, built outside of the city of Bethlehem. Magdal Eder is a watchtower. Apparently the translators of this text from Micah, the prophet of the Old Testament, don't know about the Jewish custom of having a watchtower outside of David's town of Bethlehem. Don't know that the Levites stationed themselves there from time to time during the year because they put the lambs in the base of it and they look out from the top of it to see if any ewe is dropping a lamb. The shepherds come to Magdal Eder, to the hillock of Zion, because there the new dominion shall come of the daughter Zion. The new king shall come, where he shall gather the lame and assemble the outcasts, and those who have been afflicted, and make the lame a remnant, and those driven off a strong nation. He'll give them all new homes, tiny homes or otherwise. He's going to give them a new home. He's coming back to Bethlehem, and in that tower they will see him. It says in the Gospel of St. Luke, they came to the place where the child was in the manger. That's where they put the lambs, at the base of the tower. So it's very possible that Luke has here a remnant of this memory. Writing his gospel in the 7th or 8th decade after the birth of Jesus, he might well have in his historical store of memories, he might well have a thread of this background. Remember, it says at the end of this text, and Mary, for her part, kept all these things in her mind and turned them over in her heart. If she were, in fact, a kind of literary source to the evangelist St. Luke, we have perhaps a memory of how Mary contextualized the birthday of Jesus. When that which was most unclean became the source of cleansing for the people of Israel. And he who had become most polluted would become the source of their restoration. That migration between filth and purity, between clean and unclean, of which the shepherd is associated, becomes a theme for those who follow the shepherd. Wherever the shepherd goes, I suppose, follow me. No student is better than his teacher, no pupil greater than his master. What I have done, you will do. Where I have gone, you will go. So that commute between failure and folly, or between pollution and uncleanness, to great success and restoration and purification, wholeness, this commute, the work of the shepherd, is the work of sacrifice, and is associated from the very beginning with the birthday of Jesus of Nazareth. So, in other words, we can't say to ourselves that we ought not to suffer these reversals. We must never be associated with anything humbling or humiliating or broken. No, that association is part of the commute that those who are looking for the best possible life must familiarize themselves and accept. In a charity, in a pastoral setting, in a 501c3 like the CESC, Connecting Everyone with Second Chances, there are many people here at the Carney Center, Westgate, who have had every kind of reversal and every kind of miserable association and shameful one. And yet, that which was shameful from one perspective is raised up to becoming a prayer, a sacrifice, worthy in another. That is to say, that which is most meaningless and absurd from one natural perspective of life can become that which is most meaningful, a drama which is most satisfying and fulfilling in another. Merry Christmas.